The Iowa International Center Dialogue Series is a monthly educational program available at no cost to the public, thanks to the generous support of DuPont Pioneer and supporting sponsors. Dialogue events and videos offer a unique opportunity for our community to engage in and learn from important cultural conversations with international experts, and to draw on and highlight the extensive knowledge these individuals bring to our schools, workplaces, and community. For more information about the Dialogue Series and the Iowa International Center, please visit www.iowainternationalcenter.org.
Thank you, and I want to thank especially the group from Beaverdale who came here to help pack my audience. First of all, I want to thank the Iowa International Center for allowing me to come back. I want to thank Drake University and the Nelson Center for paying my way back. It's such a pleasure to be back in Des Moines. I really love Des Moines. I like being back. I tell all my friends, and I live in Washington, D.C. now, they say, why are you going back to Des Moines? I said, because it's a great city, the people are friendly, and I really like it. So I've become a Des Moines booster back on the East Coast. I am now employed as I guess I could describe myself as an independent political consultant. I work in various contractual ways in Washington, D.C., which I need not go into. But in my career, I was a Foreign Service officer for 25 years and a UN peacekeeper for 5 years. In my career in the State Department, I worked half of my time in Latin America. I speak Portuguese from my tours in Brazil. I speak a little Spanish. I'll get to that in a little bit, perhaps. I worked the other half of my career in Africa. I served in Zimbabwe and in Sudan. I was the chief of the South Africa desk when we were trying to help South Africa forward to leave apartheid. I met Nelson Mandela during that period. During my period working on Cuban troop withdrawal from Angola, I had the chance to go to Havana, where I had Fidel Castro speak to me by poking me in the stomach for 45 minutes. It was quite an experience. I also served in Belize. I worked at the White House for President Clinton in the National Security Council, working on South America. And in the United Nations, I was chief of the peacekeeping operation in northern Kosovo, in Mitrovica. And then I was chief of staff in the UN mission in East Timor. And I retired from the State Department in 2005. I retired from the UN in 2010. They have a great retirement plan. This picture, I'm not going to speak about very much. I just like the picture. And it's a picture from Kosovo, the summer that I arrived there in 2005. All I'll say about this is that Albanians used to live here until they were chased out by the Serbs, and there was a lot of chasing out by everybody. But this is going to be something I will talk more about, and here's a plug, when I give my talk at Drake on Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. I guess it'll be in Sussman, I'm not sure. But I'll talk more about this then. I've been asked, is this going to be the same talk I give Thursday? Bob, definitely it will not be. I want to talk today about U.S. foreign policy, some specific issues, and with the basic question of, are we up to it? My basic proposition is that we are in deep kimchi. It is a very, very dangerous world, and it's not getting less dangerous. And the question, certainly for us in the United States, since we happen to be the indispensable power still, is, are we up to it? The end of the Cold War left us with no apparent overall strategy. No unifying threat, no self-evident basis for decisions about priorities, objectives, or resources, and no discipline in our decision-making. Up until World War I, we were were an isolationist power. We were focused on the expansion of our own territory. We were also, of course, concerned about the rest of our hemisphere. We had the Monroe Doctrine. But essentially, up until World War I, we ignored the rest of the world. We traded with the world. We went to the Barbary Coast at one point to help put down some pirates who now are still there in Libya. And we had to be dragged into the world. And I say we had to be dragged. It's a very interesting question, and I won't go into it here, but it's worth thinking about. It's 100 years ago that World War I started. And if you look at the history of World War I, how it started, how we got into it, you can ask, what was it about what was going on in Europe? It was essentially a European civil war that brought us into the war late, but we did spend a lot of our blood and resources there. One answer to that, although it's not necessarily clear that President Wilson had this in his mind, but you will all remember perhaps from your history that in the mind of President Wilson, World War I was essentially a war to save democracy. It was, and it led to the first attempt to try to find a way to avoid future wars by bringing a certain political order to the international community. That was the League of Nations. It didn't take. But one of the themes that I'm going to talk about here, emphasize here, is this American fascination with democracy and our belief that it is the cure for all ills, and if people don't have it, it's our duty to bring them to it. After the Cold War, a war in which it was easy to divide the world into us and them, what was our foreign policy? Our foreign policy was containment. Wherever a communist or something or some group or some government appeared to be communist or in danger of becoming communist, we went there. And we tried to contain that or overthrow it. We overthrew governments, we intervened. There were some assassinations. There were efforts to prevent the victory of world communism. And this is a very strange thing, because we professed at the same time that our system was best, that the communists had it wrong. And it's like we never really believed what we were saying. When the Cold War finally ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union, something I will tell you that almost nobody in academia or in the US government or the intelligence community predicted beforehand. When it finally ended, we were left surprised and wondering what to do. There didn't seem to be any ready formula, no ready policy, nothing to guide us, nothing to provide a coherent worldview which would then lead us to a strategy. It is worth thinking, and we'll talk more about this and maybe get to this during the question period. What are U.S. interests abroad? What should our policy be based upon? Trade, making the world safe for our trade. It used to be that we had a navy so that, as I mentioned before, Barbary pirates who got in the way of our shipping, we would go out and deal with that. Access to resources, should that be a part or central to our U.S. pursuit of U.S. interest abroad? Ideology, democracy. I'm going to return to this, but democracy is a double issue. I won't say a double problem, because I don't want to, at this point at least, prejudge, but a double issue. We both pursued democracy abroad in circumstances in which, and I'll talk about this in a bit, it may not be appropriate. And we also have especially at this point in time, and I can say this on election day, a fairly chaotic democratic government of our own, which makes it very, very difficult to pursue, to even formulate a coherent foreign policy. Now, first let me say something about conflicts. What we have seen over the past decades, certainly since the end of the Cold War, there were internal conflicts even during the Cold War. I mentioned I worked on the issue of Cuban troop withdrawal from Angola in the 80s and early 90s. This is when there were two groups fighting for power in Angola, one supported by Cuban troops and the Soviet Union, one supported by South Africa, and that's the side we gave support to. And in the middle of this, we were trying also to negotiate some sort of way out of it. I can talk more about that later if there are any questions about that. So there were internal conflicts then, and it was easy for us because there was us versus them. After the Cold War ended, these internal conflicts seemed to mushroom. With the fall of the Soviet Union, we had a change in Europe. I had the opportunity this past summer to read historical documents from 1989 from Yugoslavia. And in 1989, everybody thought that while Yugoslavia had internal issues, it was a going concern. Very few people understood that within about a year and a half it would fall apart. But in 1989, the world was reacting to the fall of the simplicity. With the end of the Cold War, simplicity vanished. It was no longer a matter of dividing the world between us and them. And everybody was reacting to the change in the power structure. There were countries that had been dependent upon the Soviet Union for support, for internal support. At the same time, it was becoming increasingly clear that the socialist, communist way of organizing an economy didn't work. So there was a lot of change with the end of the Cold War, and there were internal conflicts. Internal conflicts are generally asymmetric. That means that what we find in an internal conflict is usually we have one group that has control of the state and state mechanisms. That will mean military, Air Force perhaps, some trained units, relationships to the outside, budget, control of national territory to some extent. And we have the group that opposes them, rebels, insurgents, fundamentalists. They generally do not have access to state resources. They don't have regular armies. They don't have artillery and tanks, at least not until recently. They don't have state budgets. They don't have relationships to the outside world. And they rarely lead to negotiations by themselves because the dynamic of these internal conflicts is for them to intensify as each side uses its advantages to the maximum and each side responds to the violence. Their violence and the violence on the other side. The tendency, therefore, in other words, is if you're a guerrilla movement or an insurgent movement, let's say in an African country, and you're facing a government that is getting weapons from whatever governments outside support it, you will try to find some weapons that you can use. Generally speaking, they're not weapons of a regular army. And in the extreme case, as we see right now in the Mideast, one of the prime advantages advantages of the jihadist groups that we now face in Iraq and Syria is they're willing to blow themselves up in the delivery of violence. State powers generally don't have troops willing or able to go out and blow themselves up to defeat the other side. It's an asymmetry, and in this case, the insurgent groups have what they consider an advantage which they use. Increasingly, we've also seen these insurgent groups using terror. If you can't compete with the legitimacy of a government to win the support of people on the ground, you can terrorize them, as we see more and more in more extreme cases right now in Syria. Conflicts that we now face, in which you can see these dynamics play out: Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Nigeria, Congo, Somalia. I can add Yemen to that. In all of these conflicts, we find an asymmetric internal conflict in which we, as the world's status quo power, face the decision, what, if anything, do we do about it? If you look at this map, it's a map of failed states. You can find these maps, and this is just one I pulled off the internet. I wouldn't vouch for every single one of them. Obviously, the redder it is, the more failed or failing it is in the minds of the people who drew this up. I like the fact, though, that this map presents the United States in yellow. You see Canada. Canada is dark blue, not failing at all. Yellow, I don't know if you look at the United States right now, but according to this graphic, we're in the same, and so is Europe. And we all know about their problems with their common currency, which has no common institutions behind it. But if you look at the map and you look at the orange and red, you can see that the potential sources of instability, the places where we face internal, and this is a map, I think, from last year. I used it for my course last year. It's always constantly changing. Now, the key to understanding the conflicts that I just passed over very quickly is that they're identity conflicts. I use the term identity to cover a number of different sources of identity. The identity can be an ethnic identity, a religious identity, a tribal identity, one based upon history. A beautiful example of an identity conflict is from Gulliver's Travels. You'll remember the folks the little tiny people who went to war and were at war for a long time over the issue of which side of the egg to crack. That was an identity conflict. An identity conflict is very, very difficult to find a way to end through negotiations. They usually end when one side wins. What does that mean? When one side conquers or kills the other. Because identity conflicts are fundamental. They're about who I am and how the existence of an other challenges me. They usually end with victory by one side or as a frozen conflict. A perfect example of a frozen conflict is Israel and Palestine. Since the introduction of Israel in the land formerly Palestine, and in the mind of the Palestinians, still Palestine, that was 1948. and that conflict remains frozen. Now, a frozen conflict doesn't always stay cold, as we saw this past summer. Frozen conflicts, as long as there's no framework to push it towards or bring it towards some sort of peaceful resolution, which is very hard to do, because basically you have two groups of people who both want the same thing. They both want the same territory, they both want the same Jerusalem, they both want the same thing, and they're not willing to share. It's very hard to do. But they don't stay frozen by themselves, and they don't always remain peaceful. This past summer, we saw the latest round between Israel and the Palestinians. 67 Israeli troops were killed in this latest round, 6 civilians. 2,200 Palestinians died, including 500 children. Frozen conflicts don't always just freeze. Now, you might argue, or one might argue, that the United States conceivably has two different sorts of reasons to be involved in trying to stabilize or bring peace to a conflict area, to a frozen conflict or an active conflict. You might argue that we have a moral responsibility to do that. And in the early part of this century, because of the feeling that we in the West, certainly we in the United States, had stood back and let things happen in Rwanda, in Srebrenica, elsewhere, that there needed to be an international recognition of a moral responsibility to intercede when civilians are being killed, when there are acts of genocide or attempted genocide. And the doctrine was developed of the responsibility to protect, abbreviated usually as R2P. I'm not going to talk very much about that here. That'll be one of the things that I touch on Thursday. But the point I want to make here is you can say that the United States has a moral responsibility to intervene when people are suffering. And many Americans feel that way. And it's one of the issues that drove President Obama to do a little dance step around intervention in Syria. President Obama is understandably cautious after our catastrophes in Afghanistan and Iran. He was understandably cautious about getting us involved in the Syrian civil war. And he hung back until pressure built up politically from all sorts of people. And the thought was we needed to do something. He drew a red line, which then we didn't cross, because there was still no easy answer for how do we intervene in the complex, multidimensional civil wars within the Islamic world and within Syria. But in the end, he did decide. And this argument was essentially one about, do we have a responsibility to do something? We see people getting slaughtered and hurt. It's also possible to argue that we have a rational self-interest to prevent and resolve conflict. I mentioned before that we're the world's chief status quo power. We reap the benefits of the current world order. We sit at the top of the pile. All of the resources of the world, whether they're productive resources or natural resources, they all come come into our country and support our way of life. We have the richest, most well-off, comfortable civilization that the world has ever seen. And you could argue that anything which threatens the stability of any place in the world potentially threatens the world's stability, the regional stability in an important area like the Mideast, for example, that could in the end impact on our way of life. So you could argue either way. Problems, though, in making foreign policy. We have 536 presidents in this country. And this is for domestic issues, not just foreign issues, obviously. That number, we have one president elected, we have 100 senators, and we have 435 congressmen. And I can tell you from someone who spent 25 years working in the US State Department, nothing gets done in our foreign policy by anybody working within the government without constant attention to the US Congress and what we can get away with, or what we can get support for, or what we have to do because there's a constituency that is a big donor or sends a lot of votes to an individual congressman or senator. And it's not as if they represent a national interest. They all represent constituencies and lobbies. We also have many, many national security agencies. Back when the Republic was founded, I was a desk officer in the State Department. That's an old-fashioned term, because it used to be that there was somebody in the State Department who had a desk, and that person was like in charge of Europe or in charge of a particular area. And it was the State Department that made foreign policy, such as we had one. Nowadays, we have intelligence agencies, various ones. We have the military, various branches. We have the Department of Energy, the Department of Education, the Department of Labor. This summer, I had to read a number of cables done by labor reporting officers abroad. The most boring documents I've ever read. Labor movements in Greece. Who cares? I don't even think the people who wrote them read them. But we had labor officers in our embassies because the AFL-CIO colonized the Department of Labor. And the Department of Labor had labor officers in our embassies. And we have a fragmentation even more in our government now. So what we have is increasing politicization, bureaucratization, and careerism. Everybody who goes to work in the US government every single day, whether it's domestic or foreign, brings their own agenda to work. That agenda is lunchtime, pay increase, who I like, who I don't like, and what those idiots who are the political appointees are telling me to do, what do I think is the best thing to do, and this is replicated through our whole government. Since Wilson, as I mentioned, pursuing the effort to make the world safe for democracy, pushed by Carter, President Carter really got into this human rights stuff. And it was under him that the State Department was given the role of doing human rights reports on other countries, and the creation of a Human Rights Bureau. People who get paid to track the human rights of other countries so that we can comment on them and tell them what they're doing wrong. The problem with democracy and human rights is that it tends to exacerbate conflicts in most situations. Think of it. Unless a society is rich enough, like ours is, so that everyone can get a piece of the pie, if that's not true, if there's not enough of it to go around, people fight over what there is. And if you introduce into a country that doesn't have enough, if you introduce democracy, human rights, especially when you're an outsider, you can contribute to making the conflicts worse. Because the worst thing in democracy is you have an election, one side wins and the other side loses. And when you're fighting over or struggling over basically who gets access to scarce resources, government jobs, government budget, whatever. And if you have a society that's divided by tribe or religion, if you have one of those identity struggles, then democracy is a very difficult thing to deal with. One small thing I saw in the newspaper today in Burkina Faso. I don't know if you paid attention to that, but there was a coup in the past couple of days, and the military took over. It turns out that the military leader of the coup, who intervened because the politicians were arguing with each other, was trained, received training from the U.S. military. And yet, the first thing that our government does is they go out and say, no, 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 no. That was illegitimate, that was wrong, you've got to leave. The problem with democracy, pushing democracy, is that it sometimes also leads us into very uncomfortable situations in which people who we otherwise like turn out not to be democratic. So we have in making foreign policy, we have many agendas, many points of entry, overwhelming pressures on our political elites, Congress, the president, to raise money and please the base. So just as our domestic politics have become increasingly ideological, divisive, so does our foreign policy. It's almost impossible for any U.S. president, certainly if they happen to be African American, in a country which is still has some issues with that in many ways. It's impossible to do anything to please everybody, because there are so many different opinions, and they all have access and they all have influence. So the question is, do we have the staying power to intervene in foreign affairs? Was it a good idea for us to start getting involved in the outside world with World War I? Do we have the staying power? Do we have the commitment? Do we have the understanding? Do we have a clear and shared conception of what our national interest is? We can talk about some of these specifics if you want to get into this in the question and answer period. But Ukraine was an issue that we had some decision points. The basic decision point was, how important was Ukraine to the United States? We had not brought it into NATO because we realized that while we took NATO to the very borders of the old USSR, and we took it into the old USSR when we brought the Baltics in, making the Russians wonder, what is NATO? Why is it still directed against us? The Cold War is over. We hesitated on Ukraine. The Europeans hesitated on Ukraine because Ukraine is a basket case. And so they were not going to bring them into membership. They were going to bring them into a sort of a halfway house.